Everyone, I'm Laura Barrett. Today I'm going to present about narrative therapy. The reason why I like narrative therapy is I have been a drama teacher, writing teacher, fitness teacher in the past, and I really like the idea of using movement and stories as a way to create your identity. The history of narrative therapy started in the 1980s, and the key founders were Michael White and David Epstein. They were influenced by postmodernist thinkers Gregory Bateson, who said that reality is subjective and we create our reality by noticing differences in ourselves between situations. Edward Bruner said that identity is constructed from our experiences and our stories in our lives. And Michael Foucault said that um, basically societal rules or the stories that we learn from society or cultures can sometimes be limiting or confining to who we are authentically. The core concepts of narrative therapy are first that the person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. And basically, that means that people tend to internalize stories or narratives at a young age, and those stories can become problematic for them because those are not their stories. And it makes it difficult for them to live an authentic life. Basically, people live by their stories, and dominant stories sometimes can be limiting. And change occurs by externalizing the problem. In other words, realizing which stories are no longer serving a good purpose in one's life and deconstructing those stories or those narratives to figure out where they came from and why we're continuing to use them if they're no longer useful. And finally, reauthoring alternative stories that are more pertinent to our current situation and more authentic to who we want to be. In narrative therapy, the counseling relationship involves a collaboration between the therapist and the client. Um, the therapist relies heavily on the client as an expert of themselves, of their own internal narratives. The therapist takes on the job of looking for the client's hopes and values and asks questions to help them unpack the stories not serving them anymore and other stories that are closer to who they want to be. And then they assist the client with reauthoring their life story to make the authentic stories more dominant in their lives. And basically, they help the client with developing a new language, new metaphors, and new words to describe the person that they are now. There are a lot of populations well suited for this type of therapy because this type of therapy does well for people who have been stigmatized in some way, and that includes a lot of people. Stigmatization can result in depression, anxiety, and the other people with grief and trauma and eating disorders are limited by their stories. Children, adolescents, marginalized groups, couples, and families all can benefit from narrative therapy. So there's a lot of research to support that narrative therapy is successful in helping people through their problems. Jorgensen et al. Showed that Children with power imbalances, meaning experiencing a situation where um, they feel powerless. Narrative therapy was really helpful in helping them to construct more empowering stories for themselves. The researchers helped them with stories and games and allowed the children to develop a sense of themselves that gave them personal power in the situations in which they felt powerless. Conti et al. Looked at eating disorders and found that narrative therapy was especially helpful for people experiencing body dysmorphia because they could understand that the body dysmorphia was not really them. It was a symptom of false stories that they had internalized. And when they were able to separate themselves from those false stories, they were also able to have relief from their symptoms of things like body dysmorphia. And finally, Etemadi Charada et al. They used narrative therapy with women, Iranian women, who all had husbands who were addicted or struggling with substances. And in the group, they were able to construct a more empowering self-identity in a situation where they were very anxious and stressed out and overexerted, trying to keep their families together in a situation where their husbands were um, kind of incapacitated by their addictions. They showed that the improvements that were made in this group lasted up to 3 months after the narrative therapy ended. Narrative therapy in action. So, what does it look like when narrative therapy is used in a counseling session? First, the therapist helps the client to externalize their problem. They first have to notice what the problem is and then begin to externalize or take it and put it outside of themselves as something that is not like part of who they are. The therapist uses deconstructive questioning and helps the client to discern how this problematic thinking that they've internalized affects them in their life. Then the therapist helps them to trace expressions of their chosen identity, which often can be found when looking past the limiting narratives that are causing the problems in their lives. Next, the therapist helps the client to reauthor their life with new empowering life stories and allows the client to make that become their dominant life story rather than the internalized limiting stories that have been causing them issues in their life. Once the client begins to enact their new identity in their life, the therapist empowers them by witnessing their change. And the therapist can do this in a lot of different ways by documenting it in some way in writing or sending a letter to the client or even asking the client to get affirmation from important people in their lives about the changes that have been noticeable. So I want to give you a little sample of a dialogue that could possibly happen in a session using narrative therapy. This one is highly simplified. So something like this might take place over several sessions, but it's been condensed. And it's going back and forth between the client and the therapist. So the client says, I've just always been an anxious person. I overthink everything. It makes me feel really stuck. And the therapist replies, let's look at anxiety as someone outside of you trying to take over. What would you call it if it were a character? Hmm, maybe the doubter? It always makes me question myself. That's a powerful name. When the doubter shows up, what areas of your life does it mess with the most? Well, mostly at work, it makes me second guess my emails. It makes me freeze in meetings. It makes me feel like I'm not good enough to speak up. Yet last week you told me you led part of a team meeting. It doesn't seem like the doubter was in charge then. Oh yeah, I did. I felt nervous, but I also remembered how prepared I was. I guess I showed up as a leader that day. I love that, the leader. What would a story about you as the leader sound like? It would be about someone who still feels doubt but leads anyway. Someone who's starting to trust themselves. May I write you a letter reflecting your leader story so you can return to it when the doubter tries to take over? Yeah, I'd like that. It's easier to believe when I hear it from someone else. So you can see in this dialogue that they take what the client calls the doubter and they make it another character outside of the person, outside of the client. And the client can then tell the doubter or this person outside of them to take a back seat to the other narrative that is inside of them, the leader. And they can begin to give the leader more control and more of a bigger role in their life. So, what does neuroscience say about the effectiveness of narrative therapy? So, I have three studies here, and the commonality between the three of these studies is that narrative therapy alone, if it's done in a very cognitive way, is not as effective as when narrative therapy is coupled with accessing a client's emotions that come up when these stories or dialogues are enacted or discussed in the therapy session. When the areas of the brain that are reacting emotionally to stories are activated, it makes the default mode network of the brain kind of light up and access a lot of other areas of the brain as well. So when you are accessing a client's emotions around the narratives that they have, you are helping them to understand more clearly and more in a more embodied way how some of their narratives really limit them and really cause emotional blockage, and how other of their narratives open up their lives to change and to creating a new sense of self and a new way of being. And this new way of being can embed itself more deeply, as you can see, with all these areas of the brain are all lit up when the emotional part of the brain is activated. It creates all of this connection in the brain that creates a deeper sense, a more lived sense of memory and of self. So that is a key aspect of narrative therapy, is just making sure that you're accessing all of the emotions around the narratives that are affecting the client. So a technique that can be really helpful for clients in narrative therapy, and it's actually very close to what already happens in narrative therapy, is called the empty chair exercise, which is borrowed from the Gestalt therapy method. And the difference between the Gestalt therapy method and the narrative therapy method of the empty chair exercise is that in Gestalt, the focus is a catharsis, like emotional catharsis. And as I've said, emotion is important, but it's not like the goal. The goal in narrative therapy is to reauthor or create a new life story. It's not just about the emotional release. It's about using the emotion to create new patterns that are embedded and helps the client to have more lived experiences that they can use to become more authentic. Basically, in the empty chair exercise, you use first person pronouns, I and you, to speak to the part of yourself that you're asking to take a back seat. So, like your critic, your inner critic, you might talk to it like you, you're holding me back. Um, you won't leave me alone. You make me feel like I'm not good enough. I'm not going to listen to you anymore. So this actually goes a long way in helping the client to experience the emotions that go along with the frustration of these limiting stories. And also you could the other way around, you could have them talk to their leader, their inner leader, and have them experience the emotions that go along with um, seeing themselves as a leader. This makes their new identity more likely to become strongly established in both mind and body. So let's look at the cons and the pros of narrative therapy as a little wrap up. So the cons are that narrative therapy is less structured. So those people who they have a specific idea of a goal or something they would like to achieve. Maybe narrative therapy is a little less goal oriented than that. But I feel like it could be adapted into a goal oriented situation. Also, narrative therapy is not ideal for a crisis. In a crisis, you're going to have more immediate, direct, concrete things that you're going to help the client do. And narrative therapy is something that should be done in a situation when the client is in less of a crisis mode. Next, the cons of narrative therapy are that it does require some verbal ability and also ability to reflect. And it also may lack immediate symptom relief if something takes place over a period of time. So the pros of narrative therapy, it's non-pathologizing. You're focusing on the fact that the client doesn't have something wrong with them. It's just a story they learned. And now the therapist is drawing on their strengths and helping them to create a new dialogue, a new narrative that fits who they are now, who they want to be, the stronger, more authentic version of themselves. This therapy is client-centered, meaning the therapist is not the expert. The therapist is helping the client to be the author of their own identity. And finally, it is culturally sensitive, meaning that because it's client-centered, you are allowing clients to create the identity on their own terms, according to their own cultural identity, according to the person that they are from the background that they're from. It doesn't mean that they don't look at some of the ways their culture limits them, but it doesn't separate them from their cultural identity. So I want to thank you for listening to my presentation today about narrative therapy. I hope it was helpful. And here are my references. And I hope everyone has a really great day.